I have examples from on-premises VMware customers that were looking at, okay, we need to expand our clusters with 2 or 3 new hosts. And in the end, we ended up right-sizing all of the existing VMs, and they had already enough resources available to not buy any new hosts and still run the new project because they didn't over-provision as much anymore.
I went to a site whereby they just bought themselves a brand new VMware cluster. Their whole thing was just falling to pieces, and it ran so much slower than their primary environment did. It was the scheduler within VMware, and the fact that they'd allocated loads of CPUs to all of these machines, and they hadn't got enough physical cores over the top. So everything was trying to chop the world up into these tiny little cores and trying to grab hold of those cores to be able to work, and it couldn't.
Everyone or data over TikTok anyway, so it's fine.
You use TikTok, Christian Mo?
No, I don't.
The image of you dancing in some way, shape, or form is springing into my head at this point.
That's not an image in my head. Let's put it that way.
I would like to see it now.
So would I. Hello again, and welcome along to this podcast. I have my light this time. I'm enlightened. Hello again, and welcome along to this podcast. Today, we are lucky enough to be joined again by Marcel Mura. Thank you, Marcel. Love the T-shirt. The measure of intelligence is all I got out of the first bit, but I can't see the bomb.
Fresh cleaned for this podcast.
is the ability to change. Nice, very nice. Okay, great. It's great to have you here. Marcel, for those who don't know, is Microsoft MVP from Cologne, who works with Proact. Marcel, if you could just give a little bit of background about yourself, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm part of the teams, or let me say, I started in 2003, so a while ago. I covered the 20 years last year, and today I'm working mostly with our customers and talking about Azure Virtual Desktop and how they can use the Microsoft technology to solve their business problems. So that is what I'm doing, and also working with the other guys here in the call in projects.
Nice, yeah, and so Christian Lehrer, you work quite closely with Marcel, I know, on other projects. But so today we, as a group, are going to be bashing out Azure costs, essentially, or optimizing Azure costs. So to put no finer point on it, Marcel, how do you optimize Azure costs?
Yeah.
Just a blunt question. There you go. Yeah.
But a really good question.
Yes is the correct answer. Yes.
The biggest difference compared to to doing compute in the data center, in the own data center, is to take care about what do you need and what do you have to do if you don't need the power. A good example is in the past, and we had this before in the other podcast, we talked about switching off computers at night on premises to save a little bit of energy. And that was not so much important like it is today, not from the energy perspective, but more from the perspective that Microsoft let you pay for resources even if you don't use them. An example is the virtual machine. If a virtual machine runs 24/7, it would cost in a month, let me make a guess, 300 euros. If you switch them off at night and on weekend, you can bring it down to 100 euro. So that makes a big difference. And that is what you have to keep in mind, or customers have to keep in mind, that is different compared to on-premise work. So switch off the resources if not needed.
So Microsoft now, so essentially, are they charging you per hour rather than per day?
That is also different and related to the resources. If you come back to the computer or the virtual machine, Microsoft will invoice you on a per minute base. So each minute counts. That is the compute part, but a virtual machine also have an operating system on a disk, and the disk is charged 24/7, independent if the virtual machine is off or on. And to make it a bit more complicated, switching off a virtual machine does not mean shut down Windows. It means to deallocate in the Azure portal the virtual machine so that it's not assigned to a hypervisor on Microsoft. Then the cost stops. If you only shut down Windows, that would be a nice surprise at the end of the month.
Wow. Okay, so shutting down Windows does not shut down the machine on that basis. That is counterintuitive, shall we say?
Yeah, you get this kind of a black screen with orange letters on it that says it's now safe to turn off your computer. And then you have to turn it off. So we're going backwards.
Yeah. Good picture. and you wouldn't see this message while your remote desktop connection is away, but in the background it would stay there.
Too bad.
Nice.
Too bad.
That is great.
But how is it on other systems? Like there are a lot of when you do transition projects from on-premise data centers to the cloud, there's always the saying that you don't just lift and shift things over, right? But the reality is there are still some servers that need to be the standard SQL server, which might be on a very high load during peak times or maybe even every day, but on the weekend not. How do you go on with that to save some money? Is it also possible to just scale it down, not turn it off completely? Are there possibilities?
Yeah, and you can do it in both ways. If you have a virtual machine running a SQL server, you could downsize it on the weekend if you don't need the power. But you have to keep in mind that on the downsize of the virtual machine, the SQL server is not available for a few moments. If you have a cluster, you maybe can handle this, but you have to take care about the application and what the application is expecting. So if, for example, if the virtual machine SQL server must be run the full time, you can do that, but you must know your application. And the same is also true if you think on SQL as a service. It's a bit easier, but if you downsize a SQL as a service, which is pretty easier than restarting a virtual machine and doing a resize in between, that will make the SQL database unavailable only for a few seconds. So that is mostly easier for an application. But there is no automatism to do that. So what you need, or as a service provider, what you need to do is to now, when you don't need the full performance, and build your some automations to do the downsize and the upsize again. But there is a lot of potential. And mostly, if you start with the migrating, often that is done as lift and shift. But after lift and shift, if you don't have the time in between, it makes sense, absolutely sense, to think about going to services if possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird situation. We used to have, and this is pre-Christian Moan. This is a long time ago. We used to have data centers whereby there would be one server doing one job, and it would be on all the time because that was the nature of the game. Then VMware came along, and Christian was born. And at that point, then we had one ESX host, and there were loads of virtual machines running within that ESX host. And now we're moving up into the cloud. But one of the things that maybe that VMware didn't necessarily expect, or that we didn't realize as administrators and business people, is the fact that when you buy a load of ESX hosts and you've got, 512 gigs of RAM per host and shed loads of CPU cores and this, that, and the other, everybody went, well, I've got all these resources. Why am I not using them? So we oversized virtually every virtual machine we put into our environment because we had the resources necessary to do it. So does that, and I think that to a certain extent is kind of stuck. I've had businesses going like, oh yeah, I've got my SQL server with 64 cores and 512 gigabytes of RAM. And the immediate question that comes into my mind is, are you using all that? Because, it just makes it go faster. No, throwing cores and RAM at stuff doesn't make it go faster most of the time. So do you find that with the cloud as well, whereby people are going into the cloud and then realizing that everything is oversized?
Exactly like you say. In the past, it was more than it's better to have it than need it.
Yes.
And in the cloud area, that is different. While you have to pay for that what you have and not what you need. Yeah, I would say if you have for example, like a virtual machine, if it runs at 70% CPU load over time, that would be great. So that you have a bit left, but you are using a lot of that what you are paying for. And that is completely different to on-premises, I would say.
Yeah, that right-sizing things like this is kind of a lost art, and virtualization has been a huge cause of that, because people has, as Tony mentioned, kind of just thrown resources at stuff, hoping that will make it better. I have examples from on-premises VMware customers that were looking at, okay, we need to expand our clusters with 2 or 3 new hosts for this new project to get their resources in there. And in the end, we ended up right-sizing all of the existing VMs, and they had already enough resources available to not buy any new hosts and still run the new project because they didn't over-provision as much anymore. And that's also a discussion that's relevant again now with the new licensing changes and everything. I won't get into all of that again. But now with the new licensing things from Broadcom, actually right-sizing your existing environment also makes sense from a licensing perspective, which might reduce cost with the changes as well. So, and again, if you lift and shift everything over into Azure or whatever and do as is, that's going to be more expensive than running it locally.
Man, seriously.
So that's important. And as Marcel said, especially if you over provision resources that you don't need and you have to pay for them as you go and not as an investment cost when you buy the hardware. That's a completely different perspective business-wise than buying local hardware. So right sizing and making sure that you only provision what you need is really important. Really, really important, especially in clouds.
And also to understand the different pricing models. I mentioned the virtual machine where you have to pay the compute per minute. The disk, that is where you have to, and that is also interesting, you have to pay 24/7 while it exists. But the performance of a disk is related in Azure to the size of the disk. So if you need more performance from the IOPS perspective, you have to enlarge the disk, which costs you more, even if you don't need the full size. That is also interesting. And there's some other examples like if you think about SQL database, you have to pay per SQL database and performance, but not for the SQL server. That is not relevant, even if it exists as a resource. Opposite, if you think about web apps, you don't have to pay for 5 web apps. It costs the same like 1 web app, but there is a web app service plan, which generates the cost and the performance. So that is sometimes complicated. And what a good point to start is to use the Azure Advisor. Everybody can open it in Azure, and it gives you a good insight and also some hints what you can do from the performance perspective to go down with the costs and with the performance. And that is if you come as a consultant to a new customer, the most customers are not doing that. And if you do that, you can win again a lot and save some and directly get some ideas where you can save some money.
It's difficult though. It's difficult for techies. It's difficult for customers because generally speaking, if you have a server, let's say you've got an application that you're running and it's running on a server, and that application, let's say for example, you were running it locally on your primary site and it was working okay, thank you very much. You move it up into Azure and maybe it's a little bit slower, but then it's a little bit slower again, and it's a little bit slower again. The immediate thought on anybody is, well, if I want to add performance, I've got to add CPU or RAM. Your mind does not go to, maybe my disk latency is slow. And maybe I should add more storage to this system that doesn't need more storage to make it faster. Are there tools within it to allow you to find that information out?
Yes, you can monitor and measure, for example, the IOPS. But then you have to understand all the dependencies. And that is where we can give customers a great value to really figure out if it's CPU, is it memory, is it IOPS, is it the network, or is it the application which runs on a 64-core virtual machine but only can use 1 core.
Exactly. Oh yes. Man, I've seen that. I remember back a few years ago. I went to a site whereby they just bought themselves a brand new VMware cluster, and their whole thing was just falling to pieces, and it ran so much slower than their primary environment did, and they were up in arms, and they were adding RAM and they were adding CPU to everything to try and make it go faster, and in the end, what it was, and Christian will understand this, it was the scheduler within within VMware, the fact that they'd allocated loads of CPUs to all of these machines, and they hadn't got enough over physical cores over the top.
Mm-hmm.
So everything was trying to chop the world up into these tiny little cores and trying to grab hold of those cores to be able to work, and it couldn't. So if they dropped everything to one CPU, the whole thing ran like a dream.
Yeah.
But it was just adding more CPUs just completely screwed it.
I've had the same experience where reducing the allocated CPU to a VM has increased performance.
Absolutely, and and you think like, how is that going to work? But actually, if the application is not multi-threaded and doesn't understand more than one CPU, adding more CPUs makes no difference.
No, this is the same for any hypervisor, right? Even if it's ESXi or in Azure or Hyper-V or whatever it is, or Xen or whatever, the more CPU resources you allocate across the board, the more virtual CPUs the scheduler needs to have control over and schedule and move things around. And even if they're unused, they're still taking a slot in the scheduler. So it needs to adhere to the maximum slots and whatever it has. So it adds latency if you over provision, especially if you do it when those resources aren't needed. If they're required, you might speed it up by adding more hosts or more hypervisors. But if not, you're just introducing a scalability problem that you don't really have into your infrastructure. And that's a hard discussion to have with some customers, because getting people to understand that reducing the allocated resources might speed things up, that's a hard sell.
It is. Do you get that a lot, Marcel? Just telling people to just put less cores in, please. That sort of stuff. It'll save you hundreds of pounds a month.
Yeah, but that's the other side, right? In Azure, that probably won't be the same problem with a scheduler that scales in a different way. But adding all of those cores to a virtual machine or whatever might not increase performance, but you get a bigger bill instead.
Yeah.
So instead of things going slowly, it's going to go perhaps at the same speed that it always has. It won't increase the speed on it. It won't go quicker. The only thing you're actually doing is increasing your costs, which also doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah. I have one more thing. It's also kind of related to optimizing, maybe not cost, I don't know, but what about network latency stuff in production areas, for example? So I'm thinking about, you have your production site, your lines, and you have your MES system, and it has to put in data about every little screw that is going through your line into some system. When you have it in your environment, I think the latency between getting the information and putting it into the database is really, really good, or really low. When you put that to the cloud, how do we handle that nowadays? Are there ways to maybe use the same scalability models in like Azure or whatever cloud, but to have it on your site? I heard of something called Azure Stack several years ago, but I don't know what's the current state there. Marcel, do you have an update on that?
A bit of a complete update. So what we are using, for example, for Azure Virtual Desktop to bring the session hosts, the virtual machines, closer to the backend is Azure Stack HCI, or it's called today Azure Local. Without Stack, Azure Local.
That is Azure Local. Okay.
That is the hypervisor from Microsoft, which is also, let me say, in a kind of integrated into Azure. So it feels like, or you can also manage it from Azure, not in any perspective. Sometimes you need also to do some more locally, but if you want to have your session host, your virtual machine based on Windows 11 multi-user, that is the only allowed way to bring it close to your data backend, so into your data center. So that is what you can use from this perspective. I also know that sometimes Azure Local, Azure Stack HCI is handled as a replacement for VMware. And that is not true. That is the big difference if you compare vSphere to that what you can do on Azure local.
So basically, Azure Local is a way of bringing Azure into your own data center, not the other way around.
I would say in this way, and you can benefit from the Azure services the big word is Azure Arc. So Azure Arc is this kind of agent running on the virtual machine on Azure Local. I sometimes mix it up with Azure Stack HCI. Sorry for that. But then you have the option to also manage it from the Azure portal, shut down, start, get some information, use Azure Backup, update service, and more. That's what you can get from Azure.
So the overarching management is done from the Azure portal, even though your Azure Local stack is located in your data center.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So does that also bring the same discussion we had around cost to your local data center with running things 24/7, or is that licensed differently?
That depends also on the resource. And I'll also mention in another podcast.
How long have you been a consultant? Everything it depends. So that's
my
depends.
It depends.
Pretty much the norm. Yeah.
Interesting is that Microsoft is asking a small fee per core on Azure Virtual Desktop if you run it locally on your Azure Local. And that is interesting, while you have to think about scaling, auto-scaling also on your local resource, what you never would do if that would independent from the host. But the $1 US per hour per core, and that sums up if you have a lot of session hosts running locally on your hardware. So you have also think about shutting down the virtual machine if no longer needed and starting them early enough for your user. Yeah, you have to do something also on your local hardware related to Azure Virtual Desktop.
And do you buy this as like an appliance, or can you just go out and buy yourself a selection of generic hosts and install Azure Stack on it? Or is this something you buy from Microsoft? Do you actually go and say, I'd like 15 hosts of Azure Stack, please, and they deliver it? How does it work?
Yeah, if you do it in production, you have to buy it from a certified vendor, and there are different level of certifications, but that is the way to go. There is an option to do that also on hardware for testing purpose, but that is not supported in production environment. So there are certified vendors with certified hardware for that.
Yeah. So basically the same kind of thing that we do with VMware and vSAN. Yes. You have to add kind of certified nodes from a certified vendor.
Yeah.
That are basically certified to work with that software stack that's supposed to be installed on it, and buy it like that. It's not generic x86, even though it is, but the components are verified and put together in a package.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I mean, and what do you think the benefits are, though, of having? Is it primarily sort of like cross your local business into the stack, one control plane? Is that the primary driver for that sort of thing? Why not have, if you're running it locally anyway, why not run Hyper-V, for example? Why install Azure Stack instead? Sorry, Azure Local instead.
When I come from the end user computing, I'm mostly focused to do Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Local. That's the only
Let's call it Stack Local from this point forward. It's the way forward.
Or this metal thing on premises. That is the only supported way to run multi-user Windows on an hypervisor. So that's not allowed to do it on Hyper-V, not allowed to do it on VMware or something else.
Fine.
So if you want to use Azure Virtual Desktop with multi-user virtual machine operating system, then you must go with Azure Local.
Is this true for Windows 11 multi-session, or also in the past we used server systems for those multi-session things? Server operating systems.
Server operating system is a different thing. Right now, they are also not supported on other hypervisor in combination with the Azure Virtual Desktop backplane today.
Okay.
But I'm pretty sure that for the multi-user, what I say, that will also continue in the future, that is only for the Microsoft Azure Local or whatever the name is in 2-3 years.
Okay, so Microsoft's basically pushing the multi-session thing also to the client operating system. And for that to be fully supported, you need to go to Azure Local if you want to have it in your own data center for reasons like,
Yes.
I don't know, compliance or latency, living on a submarine, whatever.
yes, exactly. And if you think on Azure Virtual Desktop multi-user, I would always focus to use the client operating system, Windows 11 multi-user, to avoid all the conflicts maybe in the future with Office 365, M365 support.
Good point.
Not paying additional RDS licenses, what you have to do with AVD and Server OS. And then you're back in the older world with maybe complications in the future.
But how does Azure Local work at all if it's disconnected? If you have customers running things in black sites or not connected sites, does that work at all, or is it required to have internet access up to Azure to be feasible to work at all?
Azure Local will support offline mode.
Okay.
I cannot say exactly how long it can be. That is what I have to check then. But so for SQL Server, that would be fine if it run, even if the Azure Local is not connected to Azure. That is not a problem. With AVD, that would be maybe a problem if you have to authenticate to the cloud, which then would not work.
Yeah. Well, using Azure desktops in a black site doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah.
To begin with, but I was kind of thinking as a local kind of end user computing solution,
SQL,
licensing
Kubernetes,
wise.
yeah. That will work that will work also offline for a specific time. I guess it was one of the announcement of the last Ignite that Azure Local is also supposed to be offline for a dedicated time.
Okay.
I would assume at least one time a month you have to connect to upload the usage data to get the bills.
For licensing.
So they can bill you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm going to say the interesting, and let's not call it local. We'll call it neighborhood from now on, because that will be the name in about a week's time. Something on those lines.
Maybe Azure Neighborhood.
Azure Neighborhood from this point forward.
There goes the neighborhood, I guess.
Let's go to networking.
I thought about Azure Pub as well. That's also an option. Spend all your time there. Enjoy yourself.
That would be interesting.
It would. We could do that. We should be in marketing, Christian. That's the way forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So one other thing before we finish off, when it comes to clouds are deliberately complicated. I think from a billing perspective, I don't think that's doing them a disservice. The way that they make their money is by essentially trying to itemize each individual thing and allocate a charge.
That's the operating model of a cloud.
It is the operating model. And so you pay for what you use. That is the way the life is. So, I mean, are we getting to the stage, Marcel, now whereby that we almost need for it to be within any business, somebody's responsibility to do nothing else other than look at trying to optimize their cloud billing strategy? Because at the end of the day, it's very easy. And we all hear horror stories of people being caught out by cloud costs. What are your thoughts?
I think that would be a nice service if we can offer this in the future or sooner for our customers to exactly have an eye on the Azure codes, maybe not only to this codes what are generated while we are doing the service for them, maybe overall. But I think that is important and can give a really great value add. And maybe we can get the money for that on a percentage. If you save 100K, we get 10% a month. Something like that.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's it. No, just give it all to us. Whatever, that would be great. Thank you.
Then it's easier
half, like 50-50. You still saved money.
Would be a nice and interesting thing. Yeah, it is complicated. And like mentioned before, there are different kind of where how Microsoft is charging you, and there are much more. And I think that could be a good service, which directly gives value for us and also for the customer, of course, to monitor that and to do the right actions.
Yeah, and I think this is it. And I think there are so many different areas. I mean, we've talked today about virtual desktops. We've talked about SQL. We've talked about individual virtual machines. We've talked about, and there are multiple other things like SQL running as a service rather than SQL running as a server. There are storage allocations. We've talked about that as well. But all of these things have their own little quirks and nuances when it comes to the licensing of the service, don't they? So
yeah, that's all. That's just inside of Azure, and then you add Google Cloud, and then you add AWS and whatever, right? Because
but AWS is simple, right?
Just a little bit special, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Google Cloud, yeah, it's all straightforward.
Yeah, let's put everything in Alibaba, and we're done.
Yeah, Alibaba.
Tencent, don't forget Tencent, please.
Yeah,
We want to have balance here.
How many more can we think of?
Giving everyone our data over TikTok anyway, so it's fine.
You use TikTok, Christian?
No, I don't.
The image of you dancing in some way, shape, or form is springing into my head at this point.
That's not an image in my head. Let's put it that way.
I would like to see it now.
No, so would I.
But that might be a future kind of a billing way, though.
You dancing?
No, you pay with TikTok videos instead of
instead of Bitcoin.
I just wanted to say we have to somehow commingle it with the blockchain, and then it makes sense. And then some NFT stuffy around, and then that can work.
We can have different screenshots of Christian Moan as an NFTs, and we can sort of sell them off. An option.
So you're comparing me to a bored ape. Okay, fine.
Okay. There you go. Mission accomplished.
You did that, Christian.
I'll take responsibility for that. That's fine. I'll own that. No worries.
Yeah, but Marcel. So, I mean, have you got any horror stories that you've seen with regard to customers whereby there are areas where they've really got lost in the rabbit hole of costings?
I have one example.
Don't have to mention names, obviously.
Monitoring.
You don't have to mention names.
I have two, but it's interesting. I decided for this one. I get a call from one of the community who sat on the customer side, so it was not our customer, and the customer was afraid about a bill of 60K for a month of storage, only one single storage where the profiles are stored. The Logix profiles. And then we figured out that the customer made a wrong decision. He not decided for the premium file shares where you have to pay for the reserved amount of storage, not the use, the full. That would be much cheaper. But what they did, they used the simple storage account where you have to pay for the used memory. That is not so much, but in this case, they decided to use the wrong storage tier, the cold tier. And that is where you have to pay for the transactions. And that sums up. So from the 60K bill, there was 40K for the transaction. And that was the biggest mistake in this area where I have seen where the customer wasted money. So they
and we've got some sympathy for the customer,
did all the copy
in that
things,
situation.
And then they go down to 22, 24K.
Yeah, it's not like a Windows user profile gets read or written much. So yeah, I doing that on the wrong tier and such a read and write intensive area, that's going to be a problem.
The key challenge really with this though is that's not a difficult mistake to make, is it? That's not a difficult mistake. They did something that was relatively understood. They looked at it and thought, this storage looks cheaper, let's use this storage. But they didn't understand. And they got billed £40,000 more for 1 month. Does seem a bit nuts.
Exactly. And they have seen it 6 or 7 weeks later because the invoice inside of the company has to go this way before the IT department was asked why is it so expensive?
Well, I think we're probably going to have to call it there anyway, just from the point of view that I know that time is tight for us. We do have to do some work as well as enjoying ourselves on a podcast.
Oh, well, you do. So
yeah, thank you, Christian. I was sort of, where are you going to like your local Turkish bath?
No, I'm just a pretty bored ape doing podcasts. So yeah.
Nice. Okay, great. So can I just say thank you so much, Marcel, for joining us. It's been great fun, been great company, and we've enjoyed your insights into Azure and into Azure Virtual Desktops. So cheers for coming. Thank you, everybody else. It's been nice to see you all, and we'll see you again at the next podcast. Have a good one.